In the moment of making a difficult decision, particularly one that has moral implications between, let's say, two things, you undergo a process of assigning value to both options, option A and option B. One you give higher value to, and one you'll assign lower value to. And when we're faced with one of these moral dilemmas, and we start leaning towards the more moral option, we experience cognitive dissonance. And I talk about cognitive dissonance a lot, but that's because I genuinely believe that it's a sign from your soul that says this decision I'm about to make is causing conflict within me because of the gravity of the decision, because the decision, it's one that clearly has a right and a wrong, or certainly at least a right and a less right option. And for the sake of this discussion, let's say that there is a moral and an immoral option, and that cognitive dissonance is trying to wake you up. It's trying to get your mind to pay attention to this decision. And so to calm the cognitive dissonance down, we try to rationalize our decision based on our subjective moralities. You just adapt your moral relativism to that decision to make that decision no longer immoral. And of course, there are two issues with this. The first being that you can't lie to yourself. Nobody can actually convince themselves that this decision they made that again triggered the cognitive dissonance, you can't lie to yourself and convince yourself that the thing that was wrong, which you chose, is somehow right. And so the first issue with this is that the cognitive dissonance will come back up. It will bubble up again. And the second problem with this is that in that moment when the cognitive dissonance arose, that discomfort arose, you were made aware that one option was wrong and one option was right, definitively. So you lost your ignorance. You're forced into awareness that there is a right and a wrong here. Cognitive dissonance is from the soul. It's trying to push you towards the objective good. And if this wasn't the case and moral relativity were true, there'd be literally no need for cognitive dissonance in the first place. Your soul would have no reason to try to make you justify what you just did because your morals would simply adjust as needed, right? If moral relativism were actually true, but instead you have to rationalize, you have to go through that process. So we can conclude that the cognitive dissonance is a sign from the soul. It is something that pushes us in a particular direction, particularly in the direction of the good, because otherwise there would be no need to experience it in the first place. If there were no objective good, we would not experience some kind of discomfort when we chose the immoral option and then have to rationalize it. So when you experience that discomfort, that cognitive dissonance, you should look at this moment as an option to choose virtue or vice. And now I'm going to throw back to Aristotle on this one, because he would say in the midst of this decision, you've got a couple options. You could be evil, which is to purely ignore the moral option. It's to just disregard it entirely. You completely ignore your conscience. You could be incontinent, which is essentially the lack of containing that urge to do whatever the immoral option is. And this stems from the value system I mentioned at the beginning of the video, because you assign value to both things, and although you know one is right, you value the other thing more. So let's say it's an option of instant gratification and delayed gratification. Well, you would rather feel pleasure now, even though you know delayed gratification usually leads to better things. You choose the instant gratification now, and you want pleasure. The third option would be to be continent, right? To contain that urge, to recognize that there are two options here, one immoral and one moral, and to choose the moral one. But you don't fully understand and comprehend why the moral option's actually objectively better. You just feel, because your conscience, because your soul is communicating to you with cognitive dissonance, you feel that the moral option is the better option, and so you pick that one. And in that way, you act virtuously, but you fail to be a virtuous person, because being a virtuous person is the last option. So according to Aristotle, the virtuous person would choose the moral option, and they would understand why choosing the moral option leads to the greater good. Now, I would say at the minimum, we want to act with continence. Even if you don't understand why that moral good is the moral good, you can feel it innately. That's that cognitive dissonance. That's your conscience. That's your soul trying to communicate to you. The problem with continence, however, and the reason you should always push towards becoming a virtuous person, is because when you behave continently, there's a sense of loss for choosing the moral option over the immoral option. And that's because, again, at the beginning, you assigned value to these two things. So that means you actually perceived that the immoral option did contain some kind of value. And when you decline that value, you feel the loss of it. But as you pursue virtue, as you pursue actually understanding why choosing the moral thing is better in the long term, that sense of loss effectively fades to zero, because you no longer feel that the immoral option even has any value. The vice starts to lose its grip on you entirely until you no longer perceive any value in it, in which case the decision becomes easy and second nature. And that's what makes somebody actually virtuous, as opposed to just being continent. They no longer experience that sense of loss. Most importantly though, the virtuous person, because of this, because they've understood why the moral option is better, their emotions and their reason come into alignment. They no longer experience the cognitive dissonance. But it's important to note that in order to actually be virtuous, you have to be given the opportunity to choose a vice. And the reason I bring this up is because just like it's impossible to be peaceful if you can't be violent, or it's impossible to even be good if you can't have the option to be evil, so too is it true that you cannot be virtuous if the vice is not an option. And so you actually have to expose yourself to vices, to the opportunity to act on a vice, so that you can become virtuous. This is a thing you build over time through the opportunity presenting itself, you choosing the moral option, and then reaffirming your understanding of why that's always better. And over time, that turns into a second nature of sorts. And that process right there, that is what I call the will to virtue. It is orienting your will always towards that which is virtuous. The will to virtue embodies that desire to behave morally and to behave with virtue so deeply that as time goes on, you lose that sense of loss because you no longer value the immoral thing. You understand that you don't lose anything when you choose the moral over the immoral, but you gain everything. And it is precisely this shift, this will to virtue, that empowers us to begin the creation of heaven on earth for ourselves. I hope this video made you think. If it did, please like and subscribe. That helps me so I can keep making these. Thank you so much for watching.